CEO calls me and says, right, I've made a request that you are appointed on the board, and His Highness has agreed.
You've been ranked as one of the most influential women in Middle Eastern finance, amongst many other things.
I went from growing up in Australia, not being Australian enough, and being very ethnic and very Arab, and then coming out here and not being Arab enough.
Today in the world more than ever, the theme of trust and the erosion of trust has become a sticking point for so many people.
I don't want for my kids to be in the same world that I had to forge through.
Rima, I'm so excited to have you on Voices for Change by A&O Shearman today. Thank you for pulling up a seat on our couch. To kick off, I would love for you to introduce yourself, the job role you have, and what you do here within the region.
Thank you very much for having me, Justin. I am a transactions lawyer. I am a mother and a friend. I've been in the region for 22 years and currently hold the position of General Counsel at Emirates Investment Authority. I am also a mentor and take absolute joy in being involved within the legal community and the business community in helping others within to pull through the ranks.
So if we rewind, you were in Australia and then you made that pivot in 2003 to go to Bahrain, was it? Talk us through that transition, because you talk about you were an immigrant twice in the sense of your early childhood. What was it then like to pick up your life and move to a new region once again?
So at the time I was married and my ex-husband had been offered an opportunity. We thought it would be, interesting to live abroad for a couple of years. I'd never lived in the Middle East and certainly never been to the Gulf at all. I knew where Dubai was. I didn't know where Bahrain was. And our daughter was 3 weeks old at the time. And it seemed like a great idea to do that with a 3-week-old baby. It was extremely interesting in the sense that I thought that I was ethnic enough to fit in, not realizing how different it was and how different I was and what I would be perceived as. Partook within a Lebanese community in Bahrain, but it was very different than the Lebanese Australians that I grew up with. Language barriers, because the dialect is very different, and for the most part I didn't used to speak a lot of Arabic, and the Lebanese dialect is very, very different. So they understood me more than I could understand them. I hadn't appreciated cultural differences and elements there. I also had, it's not that I hadn't appreciated, but I wasn't aware of how other ethnicities or minorities were perceived as well. So the first job I held, well, actually just wanting to work, was quite a feat in itself. I remember sending out my CVs to anybody who had an email address and was lucky to get an interview with Mr. Kaisal Zabi, who's quite a powerhouse in Bahrain. And I remember him telling me, this is all great, but your baby is a few months old. She was 3 months old at the time. How on earth are you going to work with a 3-month-old baby? I remember being shocked at the question, because you would never ask that of somebody in Australia.
Of course not.
And my response literally was, that's a me problem, not a you problem. Why is, all you should care about is me delivering. So not realizing that at the time that was a bit unusual, but then commencing work and doing what I perceived to be quite normal in anybody who was commencing a position at the time. And one colleague took me aside and politely said to me, by the way, we were expecting a Lebanese lawyer. And I remember looking at her going, but I am a Lebanese lawyer. And she said, no, you're not. You're an Australian lawyer. And for the first time in my life, I needed to be educated on what the perception of a Lebanese lady was in the region and what they were expecting. I was coming across a bit strong and potentially harsh with some people because they didn't expect a lady in the position, let alone somebody who was young, in her 20s, very Western in the manner in which I dealt in business. And I went from growing up in Australia, not being Australian enough, and being very ethnic and very Arab to some people, and then coming out here and not being Arab enough and being too Western. And that was quite a learning curve for about a year to 2 years. and understanding how to use that as a superpower, and then when to be Australian and when to be Lebanese.
And it's fascinating, isn't it? Because regardless of where you are in the region, you're overcoming those different barriers, right? As you said, in Australia, some perceived you as being too Arab. And then when you came to Bahrain, people were saying actually you weren't Lebanese enough. Was that a tough experience for you to overcome?
It was, because I spent all of my life trying to identify myself, and I thought I was quite comfortable with myself. And then coming out, dealing with people's perceptions, and then learning to re-identify myself, or where do I fit in the region, in between 2-3 worlds.
It's fascinating because if we fast forward to today and the position and the influence you have in the region, you've been ranked as one of the most influential women in Middle Eastern finance, amongst many other things, which you're to be congratulated for. I know you take the influence that you do hold very seriously in this region. Why is that?
I think I take any perceived influence that I have. I'm very thankful and blessed for the experiences that I've had, and the experiences I continue, or the opportunities that I've got and that are presented to me. I believe that we all have an obligation to make the most of whatever opportunities we are given. We're not all afforded the same opportunities, or get to live in the same environments, or have the ability to build ourselves in the same environments. I don't want to leave the world in the same way that I came into it. We've all had our struggles, we all have our stories. I don't want for my kids to be in the same world that I had to forge through, or others are forging through. And I think we have an obligation, in order to do whatever we can to help others around us who are making their way into certain industries and in the world, period.
I couldn't agree more. And one thing that fascinates me as a topic of conversation is the notion of leadership and being willing to be recognized as a leader. Was there a moment in your career or your pathway where you thought, no, actually, I aspire to become a leader, or I am a leader? When did you start to actually feel comfortable seeing yourself as a leader here?
My appointment on the board of McLaren. So I had been Mumtalakat majority shareholder. I'd already been working on the file as one of our investments for a few years. And then the CEO calls me and says, right, I've made a request that you are appointed on the board, and His Highness has agreed. I was on the phone, it was a weekend, and I literally did a dance around the room. I was so excited. Growing up in southwest Sydney as a migrant, there was a stigma around people who love cars and how they're perceived, especially as migrants. And I've always had a love of cars, and I didn't want to ever show that, so that I'm not pigeonholed or prejudiced in any way. And so even when I was working on the McLaren file, nobody ever knew about my love of cars, or my background, or the fact that Ayrton Senna was an absolute hero, or Bruce McLaren's legacy. Nobody knew that I knew anything about it. And then I went on my first meeting on the board, and it was the first time I felt so comfortable discussing ceramic brakes and naturally aspirated motors, and I was allowed to be me comfortably in an environment, knowing that that was now going to be used as my advantage rather than a prejudice. And that was the first time ever that I recognized. Later people would be saying, wow, women on the board, breaking ceilings. I'm like, I'm not breaking any ceiling. I'm just, number one, doing my job. Number two, feeling absolutely blessed that I could be in an environment that I absolutely adore. And those were very important lessons, that you just needed to be yourself and allow yourself room for opportunities and to grow.
And you touched there on lessons and the themes that come with it. We've had previous conversations, and one of the things that is really important to you for any leader is to have trust and integrity within your team, and in doing so being authentic as part of it. I think today in the world more than ever, the theme of trust and the erosion of trust and authenticity has become a sticking point for so many people. What more do you think leaders can do to evidence that trust and to show organisations or the public more generally that it's a key part of being a leader?
Transparency is key all the time. And I go back to this notion of leadership and the expectations. When you allow people to understand or give them room to be vulnerable and even make mistakes, depending on the mistakes are, but to recognize that we are all in a space of growth. Not all of us will always have the answers, and our actions are bespoke to the environments that we're in, where we find ourselves. I think that in itself creates trust.
What you touched on there is so important, is that theme of dialogue and communication as well between team member and leader, and creating open channels for people to have both the healthy conversations but sometimes the more difficult ones as well. Would you say that's the case?
100%. Dialogue is everything.
Yeah.
I tell people that I've got an open door policy all the time. People need to understand that at any given time they might be faced with a situation where they need guidance. We all need guidance. But what's key here is that, that there is the opportunity for dialogue.
And one of the things I'm fascinated about with some of the material you've shared online is that theme of legacy. And I don't really hear that often spoken about by leaders. For you, from what I've seen, it's not just about what you're doing now and the impact you're having, but it's actually the legacy you're leaving for the next generation of future leaders coming through. Why is that so important for you?
It's not legacy in the sense that I need for people to know my name and to celebrate me in any way. That's not it. And actually just this morning I was having a conversation with some cousins on something, and we were discussing the legacy of my maternal grandmother, and she was the only woman at the time to be educated. She could read and write. That was super powerful. That is super powerful. And she was an orphan at the time. That was super unheard of for a woman. And yet she did that, and she forged that. And the way that she raised her 10 kids was in the same manner, that there isn't anything that's not achievable. But now when we look at it between us and the family, our outlook and our need to achieve, or the legacy that we leave behind, is important, because that's what she did for us in a very basic manner. I mean, she wasn't a professional. We don't have any lawyers or judges, but I want to wholeheartedly say that I've made it more accessible for others to achieve what they set out to do.
I love that. And actually it's a really powerful takeaway, because we often look to the grand gestures and the really big headline moments of the most pivotal, visible leaders. But actually, for me, it's that sweet spot of the everyday individual who shows up and is perhaps breaking ground in that really small area of their life that paves the way for so many others to be able to achieve something. And perhaps your grandmother is a fantastic example of that. One thing I really like to do in this podcast is for senior leaders like yourself to share some key takeaways or learnings for other leaders watching, no matter where they are around the world. We aspire to be our authentic selves, and we aspire to drop this persona and to just be ourselves within the workplace. But for some, that's actually really difficult, and it's tough because you still feel you have to look a certain way or present a certain way in the workplace. And sometimes that's an internal pressure you put on yourself. What message or learning would you share for people in leadership roles that still feel that?
Without a doubt, there will always be pressures on needing to fit in and to aspire to certain people's expectations, only because it's part of a job, but always stepping back and considering who you are, why you're there, whether you want to be there. And again, authenticity, being true to yourself, because when you are true to yourself, that's half of the stress is already gone. You're not always working hard to be somebody else. And that could be as simple as having your village that you could go back to and speak to. But authenticity and being your authentic self, I think for me, is key. Understanding that we are all different and to celebrate that difference, because that is your superpower. And I always ask this question in my interviews when I'm interviewing candidates: tell me what your superpower is.
I think in a world like today, hearing a senior figure say that is really powerful, and it's a reminder to those to keep going, to never let yourself be held back because of who you are or because of who you think you need to be for an organisation. To end, I would love to ask you to take yourself back to 8-year-old Rima, who was in Lebanon, and if you could share one message with her about what's to come or the future, what would be that powerful message you could share to your younger self?
Enjoy every part of your life specifically, and don't always be looking ahead and considering what do I need to work towards. Enjoy the day-to-day. Trust the process, and don't continuously seek to please everybody and be somebody else's picture.
When we thought about the podcast and bringing in unique, diverse voices from all across the globe, yours was one that was recommended to us by a number of people for everything you've achieved, what you give back to the next generation coming through within the region. So we just wanted to say thank you for giving your voice to our podcast and for sharing parts of your story for people. And I know they'll take a lot from it. So thank you very much.
Thank you for allowing me to be part of it. It's really important.